Some would argue most individual countries have independent national anti-poverty strategies. Why is there a need for them to start thinking regionally?
You see, most of these countries we are talking about, they're very small in size. Even a country like South Africa, which is quite huge in terms of population and resources, yet it is very small compared, say, to Indonesia.
Yeah.
The combined population of SADC is the size of Indonesia. So when we talk of regional integration, we're talking of creating a wider space for all those countries to be able to work together, trade together, and to have a sort of industrial strategy that will benefit all the countries on a sort of each one getting the same type of advantage.
Some would argue that already so many protocols exist at the SADC SACU level about resource sharing, about boosting manufacturing capacity, about easing the flow of trade. What would be required in terms of the social element for poverty? What do they need to do to all of those protocols to then start thinking about pro-poor strategies?
Yes, there are a number of protocols that have been signed, ratified, but the issue is implementation. But to implement a protocol at the country level, it has to be domesticated. By domesticated, I mean it has to be within the laws of the country. And the other problem is, when these protocols are signed and ratified, have they been discussed with the people? Has there been a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach? Very often we find that there is a top-down approach. What is needed is a dual top-down, bottom approach.
How do you define poverty? Because I could crudely say an anti-poverty strategy is job creation, making sure all people have access to jobs. For those who fall through the cracks, coming up with proper welfare and safety nets, providing basic education, healthcare, housing. And most regional economies would argue we have that.
Yes, but is it sustainable to have all those welfare nets? Where does government get the resources to provide education, health, transport facilities? You must create jobs. And by creating jobs, people pay taxes, and government can use these taxes to provide social services. It is true, in most of the SADC countries, there are social services, but are they sufficient? Do they take care for all the needs of the people? We find in most cases they are not sufficient. Housing, education, health.
I think what baffles me is the regional element of it all, because trade and more trade obviously should lead to greater business integration. And if businesses are trading across borders, generating more revenues, automatically they will expand and create jobs. Beyond that, what can be done seriously at a regional level? Because in addressing issues of healthcare or education or housing, that's the independent state's responsibility.
Yes, it's true. But at the same time, when we talk of trade, we can liberalize trade by looking at both the tariff and non-tariff barriers. We can dismantle the tariff and slowly eliminate the non-tariff barriers.
Okay.
But the issue is the supply constraints. When we liberalize, do we have enough goods to trade with each other? That's why we find that in the question in SADC, the level of intra-regional trade is quite low, because we have not addressed the supply constraints. To address the supply constraints, we should have a proper industrial strategy, using our own resources for our own development. Now what we are doing, the SADC countries are doing, it's to export the natural resources. But there is no beneficiation as such. What we need to look at is add value to our own resources, create jobs, create wealth, and then we'll be able to address those problems that you are raising.
What about the fact that you've got so many disparate economies in SADC? You've got this hegemon, South Africa, which is a fairly diverse economy. You've got a fairly diverse but small economy in Namibia and in Botswana. And then you've got very vulnerable and small economies in countries like Lesotho and Swaziland. And what we really need is a catch-up from some of the smaller ones, so that the dependency on trade, the dependency on revenue earnings from the Southern African Customs Union doesn't fall squarely on the shoulders of South Africa. So that's really those countries needing to come up with dynamic policy programs for industrialization.
It's true. If we've got a regional industrialization policy, it should be a win-win situation where each country benefits from this industrialization policy. But then the issue is there are big countries like South Africa, and there's the fear of polarization that if we open up, there would be massive investment into South Africa. But at the same time, if the investments in South Africa is also channeled to the other countries, for instance, when we look at the Checkers, ShopRites, Pick n Pay, they go and invest in countries like Zambia, Mozambique, and they import the bulk of their products from South Africa. This might be corrected. We might ask them to import a part in South Africa, the majority, but also to source from these countries. And what will happen? They will create employment. They will allow the people to produce more. Then they create a market for themselves. You know, in SADC we've got about 60 to 70 million people living below the poverty line. This is the question you asked earlier on. And they earn less than $2 per day. But let's look at it in another way. These 60, 70 million people, they are also a market. Their propensity to consume is very high. It's just a question of giving them the purchasing power, and there will be a market for all of us. But then how do you do that? The challenge is, how do we create a market?
I think the next time we have you on the show, that's the question. That's where we begin. How do we create the market in SADC? Thanks so much for your time.